So how long has Julian been in prison already?
Well, he's been in prison for 5 years and a week now, 5 years and 7 days. Uh, Before that, he was also in a situation of confinement because he wasn't allowed to leave the Ecuadorian embassy without being arrested by British authorities, even though he wasn't charged with anything during those 7 years that he was inside the embassy. He hasn't. I think the maybe another way to put it is that Julian hasn't been a free man since the 7th of December 2010, which is when he was first arrested. And although he was released on bail initially after 10 days in prison, there's always been some type of restriction on his movements, and increasingly so over time, to the degree that now he's in Belmarsh, where he's been for 5 years, and he risks being extradited to the US, where it would be even more isolation and maximum security prison conditions.
Why the United States is so eager to get Julian extradited to the States?
Well, I think there are different factions within the United States. This case has always been a controversial one throughout the different administrations. In fact, the Obama administration, which was the first one that was investigating these publications, which had to do with the U.S. Military operations and dealings in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the war on terror, diplomatic exchanges, and Guantanamo Bay. All this during the Obama administration, there was a criminal investigation, and then there was an announcement at the end of Obama's presidency that Chelsea Manning's sentence, Chelsea Manning being the source of these publications, the sentence that she got, which was 35 years, would be commuted, and she was released a few months later. And also the announcement that Julian would not be prosecuted, and the reason was that this would set a precedent against the rest of the press, and even though they had tried to find a way to prosecute him, there was no way to do it that didn't pose basically an existential threat to press freedom protections. So that was the position of the Obama administration. Then the Trump administration came, and factions within there have always been factions within the U.S. Executive that have been trying to increase secrecy and to increase the penalties for breaches of secrecy. And we've seen since the Obama era that those penalties increase first towards the sources of the news stories, the whistleblowers, Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden, etc. But with Julian's prosecution, there's a real shift because Julian isn't being prosecuted as a whistleblower. Everyone knows, it's the U.S. case is that Chelsea Manning was the source. Chelsea Manning was the one with obligations towards the United States, and that Julian, as a foreigner who was outside the U.S., and as the publisher, the receiver of the information, he is now culpable under this prosecution. So basically, during the Trump administration, that faction of the U.S. Executive got the power to pursue this, and even during the Trump administration, it was controversial. There were several prosecutors on the case who were taken off the case because they disagreed with the way it was prosecuted under the Espionage Act. And then the Biden administration has continued the Trump administration's prosecution and has basically endorsed it. Although we've seen some signs that, they're apparently considering maybe not pursuing it, but it's hard to know.
Yeah, Biden mentioned that they will maybe drop the charges against Julian. But do you think that Biden is scared of CIA, as we mentioned this before in I think in the media?
I think all everyone in the U.S. is afraid of the CIA. Presidents and Congress, of course, there was a very telling moment during the congressional investigation into the torture regime of the War on Terror. This was around 2014, and there was an effort to try to get to the bottom of the CIA's torture program, and the U.S. Congress had access to documents and so on. And then, sorry, my cat is hungry, I think. And it was discovered that the CIA, in fact, hacked into the congressional offices, the researchers and Congress people who were involved in this investigation. And I think it was Senator Feinstein who was shocked at the powers that the CIA has, and of course, and not just the CIA, but the intelligence community in the 70s. There were a number of oversight committees that were set up in the context of basically boundless powers by these in these intelligence agencies that had been involved in, of course, not just spying domestically, but even in like domestic plots of assassination and so on against political leaders of unfavorable political stripes. And so there were congressional oversight committees, the Church Committee, and the Church and I forget the other name. And then there was a moment of kind of oversight. And these committees of oversight still exist, but they've basically either been co-opted, or we know that they are powerless to not be completely monitored, because the capabilities of these intelligence agencies are basically boundless. So, of course, politicians inside the United States know that they're vulnerable, and it's a huge democratic threat that there is no effective oversight or effective way of reining them in.
And also, Justice Johnson is leading Julian's case now at the court here in London. And we could see in the WikiLeaks documents that he was mentioned that he was involved with MI6 in some corporations. Do you think that this is putting him in very kind of sensitive position of impartiality in case with Julian?
I have to be careful with what I say, because Julian is still subjected ultimately to the decisions of the two judges sitting in the High Court. And what I say publicly isn't the same as what I think and say privately. So I don't want to say anything that could damage Julian's chances of winning in the United Kingdom. But others, it's a matter of public record. The trajectory of both of the judges who are deciding on Julian's fate. And I think, well, I can say more about the process, but maybe you should just move on.
Yeah, no problem. So do you? So what's the next step now with the case? Today is the deadline for the United States to give the assurances for Julian's appeal. So what's happening with this?
Well, look, I just did a couple of tweets today. The big picture here is that the US has been given endless opportunities to reformulate their case. There are 3 different indictments, one after the other. And then when the courts have seen a barrier to being able to extradite him because the legislation, the conditions for stopping the extradition are met, then the courts have invited the US to make a political promise, so-called diplomatic assurances, which are unenforceable for Julian and for the UK for that matter. But it's a promise made between states, and you would, even if from any point of view, assuming the UK was acting in good faith and the US down the line violated the assurances, then it would have to be the UK who would go to the US and say, hey, you're breaking your promise. This, of course, is never going to happen. The UK acting for Julian's interests. This is basically an out for the court when met with a problematic decision. Then they say, well, this is problematic according to the legislation, but we're going to get a political promise. So that's already happened once before in relation to his conditions of imprisonment back in 2021. I think the decision came down in 2023. Finally, the extradition was ordered on the basis of assurances. And then Julian made an application to appeal the extradition, and then the British courts have. Sorry, I'm getting into a bit of detail here, but the big picture is that the US has given endless opportunities, and Julian, in fact, has been given none. Even now, it was kind of reported that he had been granted permission to appeal, but in fact, he hasn't been granted permission to appeal. He's been granted conditional, provisional permission to appeal. So we're talking even just at the second level, the High Court, right? There's the Supreme Court on top of that. He is battling to be able to get an appeal opportunity, and the courts back in February said that he would be able to appeal if the court was not satisfied by assurances given by the US. So basically, the court then said Assange can appeal unless the US gives assurances now. So why would it do this? Well, there's going to be a hearing in May 20th, where Julian can contest assurances, right? If the court sides with the US, then he won't have an appeal. And what's the difference between like this preliminary hearing on the May 20th and an actual appeal? Well, an actual appeal would then result in Julian being able to at least apply to the Supreme Court to get that decision reviewed. But with this provisional decision, the provisional hearing on May 20th, if the court sides with the US, Julian is not able to ask the Supreme Court to review it. So it's a bit, okay, I'm going into a bit of procedural detail here, but I'm trying to illustrate how the US is given endless opportunities, and Julian is given obstacle after obstacle, even to just be able to appeal the point.
Yes, I can see that. And do you think, so whatever the judgment will be, do you think this judgment for Julian will have also any implications on the journalism as a profession?
Completely. I mean, if you look at the judgment as it stands, the only issue that the British courts have asked, or 2 issues that the British courts have asked the US to issue assurances on, are firstly on the death penalty, and secondly on whether he will be able to access constitutional protections in the United States and that he won't be discriminated against on the basis of his nationality because he's Australian, he's not American, he hasn't lived there, and so on. So there are rulings in the United States by the Supreme Court saying that foreigners have no constitutional rights. So this is one of the aspects, but the British courts only identified this problem in relation to publication. So publication is 3 out of the 17 Espionage Act charges. The rest of the Espionage Act charges relate to receiving and possessing information. So, of course, receiving and possessing information are part of the news gathering process necessarily. You don't invent the information, you have to get it from somewhere. And if you're given information or you happen upon it or whatever, you are possessing it, and in some cases receiving it. And that is also criminalized. The statute is so broad in the United States that the effect is mind-blowing. And of course you can it's so broadly worded that you could read possessing information in your brain as a criminal activity, or so that's how broad it is. That's how that was being argued during the extradition hearing. So the implications for journalism generally are very grave, both by how the criminal act is defined, but also because of the extraterritorial reach of this prosecution, because it's a foreign country, the United States, that's reaching into the European territory to determine what can be and what cannot be published here. And if you do publish it, even if it's legal to do so within this jurisdiction, they can extradite you and introduce you into a foreign jurisdiction and try you under their laws. So it's completely a completely deranged proposition, which of course will be seized by other countries who are seeking to punish their own dissidents or foreign critics. And all you need is another country to play ball. And of course, in extraditions, it's 99% politics and 1% law. And if the country and their court system is unwilling to antagonize or offend the United States or whichever jurisdiction it might be, then the person is going to be powerless. And of course, Julian's case being such a high-profile case and such a kind of obvious case in which the publications actually revealed the U.S.'s own criminality, then this is something that is shifting the political landscape. It creates not just a legal precedent, but a political precedent, and journalists are vulnerable everywhere.
Okay, and one last question. So we're going a bit back to the CIA. So what's about the CIA plot to apparently kill Julian, and why they didn't do it so far?
Well, there are different aspects to this. I mean, it's important to point out that the British courts have said that this murder plot is plausible, and that there's they didn't contest the evidence, and they said it appears to be true. But what they said was, now that the United States is seeking to extradite him, there's no need to kidnap or kill him. And that's how they got out of that, which is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, I just I don't know how a decision like that can be taken and expect the credibility of the British justice system to remain intact after that. So what we have is courts that have never been denied, which the British courts accept as true, that Julian was the victim of a murder conspiracy under the Pompeo's leadership of the CIA. There were plans that were drawn up, and again, it was a controversial decision by Mike Pompeo, because basically what he was doing was deploying the clandestine operations that are dedicated towards actual security threats, like legitimate security threats, and then take that machinery and turn it towards a publisher as revenge for the true information that the publisher revealed, and to stop future publication, basically. I mean, this is clearly the most aggressive type of censorship that you can imagine, which is to just kill and destroy the journalist, the publication, and so on. So that much was elaborated, and the plans that were revealed in these publications, it seems they were elaborated, and then the National Security Council, which is the US kind of multi-agency committee involving White House lawyers and various officials from the national security community at the very top, it seems they didn't go through with it because there was also opposition within that committee, let's say. But those plans were real, and we simply don't know to what extent they were ready to be implemented. There were discussions of ramming cars, of opening fire, and so on. And within such in the context of diplomatic immunity, on top of it, of course, in a chaotic scenario like that they were planning for, Julian could easily have been harmed or killed. So I don't think it's realistic to suggest that these plans were discarded. I think they were always on the table during a time where Pompeo held the reins, and maybe beyond, because there was also reports that kidnapping had been discussed even before Pompeo was before he was head. So we're talking about illegal activities that the United States has been engaging in, of course, spying on lawyers and so on. But I mean, the most extreme, of course, is the murder plot against Julian. And why have they not done it yet? Well, I disagree with the court's decision that they have no need to do so since he's being extradited. I don't know where they reached that conclusion, because there's a very plausible argument that extraditing him would make it easier to assassinate him, rather than doing it on foreign soil, doing it on U.S. soil. Of course, you can do that more easily if you're minded to do that on domestic soil, and especially in a prison, as we all know.
Stella, thank you very much for your broad explanation of the facts and your time. And I wish you all the best luck, and we will continue to follow the Julian's case.